Hello, supply chain friends. One of the questions I've been receiving more recently is, are tariffs good or bad for my supply chain career? Well, in this video, I will cover with you a little bit of a history of tariffs because it's not a new concept, to be very honest. What are some of the good or bad examples of tariff regimes in the past which have positively or negatively contributed to supply chain jobs? And most importantly, what are some of those key skills you need to build within the supply chain space in order to make the best out of this current tariff situation? My name is Jamil Hai, and I've been working in supply chain management positions across South Asia, Middle East, and North America for more than 20 years. And my mission is to help supply chain professionals like you build real life skills for your job and career that they don't teach you in college. And if you are preparing for a supply chain job interview anytime soon, you should definitely book a session with me because I'm going to take your resume, the job description you're applying for, and based on a combination of those two and my 20 plus years of experience, will give you some laser guided tips and tricks which will maximize your chances of success. So go ahead now and book your session. So first of all, let's try to understand what a tariff really is. Now, in very simplistic terms, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Simply, let's say if I make a car locally, I want to protect my local industry. So which means if somebody is exporting a car to my country, I will put a tax on that import because I really want to protect my local industry. So historically, tariffs, for obvious reasons, have been used to protect a local industry. The tariffs have been around forever almost, because if you really go back and study the history of tariffs, they have been around almost, when the Roman Empire was there. So tariffs were imposed during that time. Then when the British Empire became dominant, they were using tariffs as a way to make money because they were controlling a lot of land at the time. And as United States gained independence, then tariffs became a norm there as well. We'll study the US history on tariffs in a bit more detail in a second here. And then in 1947, there was something called the General Agreements of Tariffs and Trade, a GATT document signed, which basically defined some of these tariff regimes around the world in the post-World War II setting. And slowly, that GATT agreement gave way for more free trade over time, and eventually that GATT evolved into something called the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, in 1995. And talking about development, if you're a line manager and you're interested in developing your team's supply chain capability, then I strongly recommend this platform called SCMDOJO for Business. And what I like about this platform is that if you're a line manager, you have full control on how you can track the development and progress of your team members. It gives you a lot of different analytics, and it helps you build your team's supply chain capability in a very structured way. So definitely check it out. Now, talking about the US, let's look at 4 examples from the US history where in 2 of them, tariffs have actually helped supply chain jobs in the US, and the other 2 where tariffs have hurted the US economy in general and hence also negatively impacted supply chain jobs. So the first example where the tariff regime helped the supply chain job market in the United States were the early protective tariffs in the 1790s and early 1800s. This was a time when US was still a very young country. They just got independence, and the tariffs were designed to protect the nascent industries there from any foreign products so that they could basically build their local manufacturing industry up to a point where it became pretty powerful. So tariffs were imposed on imported goods like textiles made from in the British Empire and so on and so forth. And then the impact it had on the domestic economies, because this was highly protective and this was still the time when the world was not very open, this was really helping the US manufacturing sector. A lot of manufacturing industries were developed during that time, and hence it was creating a long-term job growth prospect for people working in production, transportation, logistics, because this is where the Industrial Revolution was almost about to get at its peak. And then later on, as the manufacturing industry in the United States even further developed and they started building cars, it became even stronger, and that was really the birth of the US supply chain industry. And the US is not a unique country which did this in its initial phase of its existence to protect its local economy and local manufacturing industry. If you look at India's example, India did the same thing from 1947 all the way up to almost 1990, India was a very protective market from an economic point of view. But look what it did to the Indian manufacturing industry, because during that time, the thought process of the leaders was that we really want to build our internal manufacturing infrastructure. That is why India was able to produce so many of their local brands, right? So if you look at India now, most of their car manufacturing is done locally. Even foreign companies which sell cars in India have built factories over there just to tap into such a huge economy. So a protective regime or a tariff regime in the initial stages of any country, at least history tells us, is very helpful because it helps you build that local economy. However, of course, in the longer term, because tariff is not really a productive cost, it's basically a tax you are paying, so it doesn't really help the consumer prices because consumer prices are high. So that is the context that we need to keep in mind from a global trade perspective. Similarly, in the 1960s, the US imposed something called the chicken tax. Now, why is it called the chicken tax? Because back in those days, Europe imposed a duty or a tariff on US poultry. So as a retaliatory effort, United States put a tariff on something that Europe is still very much well known for producing, and that is cars. So they put a pretty high tariff, I think a 25% tariff on imported light trucks and vans coming in from Europe, and that basically really helped the US local manufacturing industry. So two examples of that were this forced companies like Toyota to put a factory in California. Then Volkswagen also put a factory in Pennsylvania. And that is an example of how tariff really promoted local manufacturing in the United States. And of course, because of that, it created jobs, it created supply chain jobs in manufacturing, assembly lines, warehousing, logistics, and so on. Now let's look at two examples where tariffs were not necessarily very helpful. One of those two examples is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of the 1930s. This was the time when the world was between the two wars. So after World War I, the world was still reeling with the after effects of that. That kind of pushed the world into something called the Great Depression, which was probably one of the worst economic times in the last 100, 200 years. And at that time, there were these congressmen in the United States, Smoot and Hawley. They convinced Congress to put this tariff regime where they put tariffs on almost 223,000 types of goods. And that really worsened the Great Depression even further. So imagine your economy is already slowing down, and then you put tariffs, so that slowed down the economy a lot. And this might sound, I don't want to really project like a recession here, but it's very similar to the current situation where regardless of the tariffs, our world was just recovering from a pandemic, and now we have got all these tariffs. So this is not a great example of what could happen for us in the near term, but at least we should learn some lessons from the history. Another example where tariffs now did not necessarily help the overall industry, including supply chain, was this whole tariff debate about steel. And by the way, the current government is not the first to impose tariffs on steel in the US history. Even in the recent US history, steel tariffs were implemented by George H.W. Bush's government back in 2002, and they imposed a 30% tariff on imported steel with an intention to promote local steel industry and to spur more local jobs in steel manufacturing in the US. But did that really happen? If you look at data, that tells us a different story. If you look at the chart on the left, it shows you the employment in the steel manufacturing industry in the United States. And you can see that in the aftermath of those 2002 tariffs implemented by George H.W. Bush, the employment did not come back. It kept sliding down. And then even when Trump put the first tariffs in 2016-17, the steel jobs did not really come back into the market. And if you look at the chart on the right, who has been really winning this whole steel manufacturing war per se, if you were to use the term war for this, is China. So if you look at the chart on the right side, steel manufacturing in China has significantly increased over that time. And despite all the tariff efforts made by the US government, manufacturing of steel has not really come back to the US, or it hasn't really moved the mark, because at the end of the day, We have moved away from the world where countries were newly formed, so they were trying to protect their own economies. Now we have lived for quite some time in a free trade world. So in this environment, trying to go back in time and putting tariffs may or may not help. And in this case, these are some examples where it's showing it's not really helping. So having looked at this history now, let's look at what are the skills in a tariff regime from a supply chain point of view, which can help you win. And this is very important for your development. So this is a chart that shows our current tariff as compared to some of the historical tariffs. And while the spike that you see right now in April 2025 is not as high as what we had like 200, 300 years ago, but it's the highest tariff regime in the US in the last century. And that's why there's a high chance that this might result into net job loss. But I've got some good news as well. So if you are in supply chain and if you are in that supply chain resilience space and you've got skills around sourcing, risk management, negotiation, those are very important skills in this environment, because imagine as the companies are trying to reconfigure their supply chains, they are trying to potentially even move their factories around. What do you need? You need new contracts, which means that sourcing is very important. You need to risk mitigate your business, because as you are moving your sources, you have to minimize risks, so risk management becomes very important. And of course, because all of this could mean new contracts, so contract negotiation is very important. Similarly, if you are in the manufacturing bucket, this could be good news for you, because even if, I mean, this is very debatable whether how many manufacturing jobs will come back to the US in the next 5 years or so on. However, even if, let's say, 10% of those jobs are reshored to the US, that would mean that there will be a pretty significant increase in the demand for people who know manufacturing. So manufacturing jobs could definitely improve. And project management is very important, because if you are reconfiguring your supply chain, that has to happen through different projects, right? So let's say you were sourcing from X, now you're sourcing from Y. This means that as you are moving that sourcing, there will need to be project managers who can manage that transition or manage those projects. Similarly, planning will become very important again. Planning is already very important, but it will even become more important, because when you are transforming your supply chains, planning really needs to be at the core of your thought process. And then finally, if you are someone who knows the regulatory and the trade compliance side, if you are someone who understands the trade rules very well, these jobs may or may not sit in the supply chain umbrella of companies. Every company operates a bit differently. But if you are someone who has a very good understanding of the trade policies of different countries, not just the US, this can be really, really helpful for you, because that skill set certainly will be even more required, because as the administration keeps changing its rules, somebody will have to really constantly monitor what do those new rules mean and how the companies can adapt to it. So certainly you could see an increase in the demand for people who know regulatory and compliance skills. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I've also made videos on topics like how to enter supply chain from another profession, and what are the top 5 books every supply chain manager should read, which you can watch by clicking over here. Keep watching.